You. I just got out of the shower. I'm in a different location today. So I was looking through the library where I'm staying, and they have a giant H.P. Lovecraft book, Great Tales of Horror. So I feel like this is a great opportunity to read some Lovecraft. Let's see. I hope they have Shadow Out of Innsmouth because that's like my favorite one, but I don't think it's in here. Okay, we're gonna read that one. That should take a nice long time. That's like a 50-page short story, you guys, but it's my favorite. It's my favorite Lovecraft short story. Um, okay. I'm gonna start with that one. Okay. Shadow over Innsmouth. There's a foreword. I'm gonna read it. Written in November to December 3rd, 1931, this novella was the result of Lovecraft's attempt to write a story in different manners to see which method worked best. A previous draft is extant in fragments. See appendix. The town of Innsmouth, first cited as Celephaïs, is largely based on the Massachusetts coastal town of Newburyport. Although today, Newburyport looks very different from the decaying backwater that it was in Lovecraft's day. He had first visited it in 1923 and revisited it in the fall of 1931. Some details of the story appear to be derived from Irvin S. Cobb's Fishhead and Algernon Blackwood's Ancient Sorceries. But its evocation of the insidious decay of an entire community is Lovecraft's own. Rejected twice by Weird Tales, it first appeared as a crudely bound booklet issued by William L. Crawford's Visionary Publishing Company in 1936. Okay, part 1. During the winter of 1927 to 28, officials of the federal government made a strange and secret investigation. Let me see if I can get the light right. They made a strange and secret investigation of certain conditions in the ancient Massachusetts seaport of Innsmouth. The public first learned of it in February, when a vast series of raids and arrests occurred, followed by the deliberate burning and dynamiting, under suitable precautions, of an enormous number of crumbling, worm-eaten, and supposedly empty houses along the abandoned waterfront. Uninquiring souls let this occurrence pass as one of the major clashes in a spasmodic war on liquor. Keener news followers, however, wondered at the prodigious number of arrests, the abnormally large force of men used in masking them, and the secrecy surrounding the disposal of the prisoners. No trials or even definite charges were reported, nor were any of the captives seen thereafter in the regular jails of the nation. There were vague statements about disease and concentration camps, and later about dispersal in various naval and military prisons. But nothing positive ever developed. Innsmouth itself was left almost depopulated, and is even now only beginning to show signs of a sluggishly revived existence. Complaints from many liberal organizations were met with long, confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive and reticent. Newspapermen were harder to manage, but seemed largely to cooperate with the government in the end. Only one paper, a tabloid always discounted because of its wild policy, mentioned the deep-diving submarine that discharged torpedoes downward in the marine abyss just beyond the Devil Reef. That item, gathered by chance in a haunt of sailors, seemed indeed rather far-fetched, since the low black reef lies a full mile and a half out from Innsmouth harbor. People around the country and in the nearby towns muttered a great deal amongst themselves, but said very little to the outer world. They had talked about dying and half-deserted Innsmouth for nearly a century, and nothing new could be wilder or more hideous than what they had whispered and hinted years before. Many things had taught them secretiveness, and there was now no need to exert pressure on them. Besides, they really knew very little, for wide salt marshes, desolate and unpeopled, keep neighbors off from Innsmouth on the landward side. But at last I am going to defy the ban on speech about this thing. Results, I am certain, are so thorough that no public harm save a shock of repulsion could ever accrue from a hinting of what was found by those horrified raiders at Innsmouth. Besides, what was found might possibly have more than one explanation. I do not know just how much of the whole tale has been told even to me, and I have many reasons for not wishing to probe deeper. For my contact with this affair has been closer than any other layman, and I have carried away impressions which are yet to drive me to drastic measures. It was I who fled frantically out of Innsmouth in the early morning hours of July 16th, 1927, and whose frightened appeal for government inquiry and action brought on the whole reported episode. I was willing enough to stay mute while the affair was fresh and uncertain, but now that it is an old story, with public interest and curiosity gone, I have an odd craving to whisper about those few frightful hours in that ill-rumored and evilly shadowed seaport of death and blasphemous abnormality. The mere telling helps me to restore confidence in my own faculties, to reassure myself that I was not simply the first to succumb to a contagious nightmare of hallucination. It helps me, too, in making up my mind regarding a certain terrible step which lies ahead of me. I never heard of Innsmouth till the day before I saw it for the first, and so far, last time. I was celebrating my coming of age by a tour of New England, sightseeing, antiquarian, and genealogical, and had planned to go directly from ancient Newburyport to Arkham, whence my mother's family was derived. I had no car, but was traveling by train, trolley, and motor coach, always seeking the cheapest possible route. Hold on 1 second. The dog wants to get on the bed. Come on. Let's go. Let's go, guys. Okay, they're going to take a minute. I will continue. In Newburyport, they told me that the steam train was the thing to take to Arkham, and it was only at the station ticket office, when I demurred at the high fare, that I learned about Innsmouth. The stout, shrewd-faced agent, whose speech showed him to be no local man, seemed sympathetic toward my efforts at economy, and made a suggestion that none of my other informants had offered. "You could take the old bus, I suppose," he said with a certain hesitation. The animals have joined me on the bed. Here you go. Animal cam. Okay, I will continue. "You could take that old bus, I suppose," he said with a certain hesitation. "But it ain't thought much of hereabouts. It goes through Innsmouth. You may have heard about that. And so the people don't like it. Run by an Innsmouth fellow, Joe Sargent. But never gets any custom from here, or Arkham either, I guess. Wonder it keeps running at all. I suppose it's cheap enough. But I never see more than 2 or 3 people in it. Nobody but those Innsmouth folks. Leaves the square, front of Hammond's drugstore, at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m., unless they changed lately. Looks like a terrible rattletrap. I've never been on it." That was the first I ever heard of shadowed Innsmouth. Any reference to a town not shown on common maps or listed in recent guidebooks would have interested me, and the agent's odd manner of allusion roused something like real curiosity. A town able to inspire such dislike in its neighbors, I thought, must be at least rather unusual and worthy of a tourist's attention. If it came before Arkham, I could stop off there, and so I asked the agent to tell me something about it. He was very deliberate, and spoke of an air of feeling slightly superior to what he said. "Innsmouth? Well, it's a queer kind of town down at the mouth of Manoxet. Used to be almost a city. quite a port before the War of 1812, but all gone to pieces in the last 100 years or so. No railroad now. B&M never went through, and the branch line from Raleigh was given up years ago. More empty houses there than there are people, I guess, and no business to speak of except fishing and lobstering. Everybody trades mostly either here or in Arkham or Ipswich. Once they had quite a few mills, but nothing's left now except one gold refinery running on the leanest kind of part-time. The refinery, though, used to be a big thing. And Old Man Marsh, who owns it, must be richer in Croesus. Queer old duck, though. And sticks mighty close in his home. He's supposed to have developed some skin disease or deformity late in life that makes him keep out of sight. Grandson of Captain Obed Marsh, who founded his business. His mother seems to have been some kind of foreigner. They say a South Sea Islander. So everybody raised Cain when he married an Ipswich girl 50 years ago. They always do that about Innsmouth people. And folks here and hereabouts always try to cover up any Innsmouth blood they have in them. But Marsh's children and grandchildren look just like anyone else so far as I can see. I've had 'em pointed out to me here, though come to think of it, the elder children don't seem to be around lately. Never saw the old man. And why is everybody so down on Innsmouth? Well, young fellow, you mustn't take too much stock in what people around here say. They're hard to get started. Once they do get started, they never let up. They've been telling things about Innsmouth, whispering 'em mostly, for the last 100 years. I guess, and I gather they're more scared than anything else. Some of the stories would make you laugh. About old Captain Marsh driving bargains with the devil and bringing imps out of hell to live in Innsmouth. Or about some kind of devil worship and awful sacrifices in some place near the wharves that people stumbled on around 1845 or thereabouts. But I come from Panton, Vermont, and that kind of story don't go down with me. You ought to hear, though, what some of the old-timers tell about Black Reef off of the coast. Devil Reef, they call it. It's well above water, a good part of time, and never much below it. But at that, you could hardly call it an island. The story is that there's a whole legion of devils seen sometimes on that reef, sprawled about, or darting in and out, or some kind of caves near the top. It's a rugged, uneven thing, a good bit over a mile out. And toward the end of shipping days, sailors used to make big detours just to avoid it. That is, sailors that didn't hail from Innsmouth. One of the things they had against old Captain Marsh was that he was supposed to land on it sometimes at night when the tide was right. Maybe he did, for dare I say the rock formations was interesting. And it's just barely possible he was looking for pirate loot, and maybe finding it. But there was talk of his dealing with demons there. Fact is, I guess on the whole of it was really the captain that gave the bad reputation to the reef. That was before the big epidemic of 1846, when over half of the folks in Innsmouth was carried off. They never did quite figure out what the trouble was, but it was probably some foreign kind of disease brought from China or somewhere by the shipping. It surely was bad enough. There was riots over it, and all sorts of ghastly doings that I don't believe ever got outside of town. And it left the place in awful shape. Never came back. There can't be more than 300 or 400 people living there now. But the real thing behind the way folks feel is simply race prejudice. And I don't say I'm blaming those that hold it. I hate those Innsmouth folks myself, and I wouldn't care to go to their town. I suppose you know, though I can see you're a Westerner by your talk, what a lot of our New Englander ships used to have to do with queer ports in Africa, Asia, and South Seas, and everywhere else, and what queer kinds of people they sometimes brought back with them. You've probably heard about the Salem man that came home with a Chinese wife. And maybe you know there's still a bunch of Fiji Islanders somewhere around Cape Cod. Well, there must be something like that, back of the Innsmouth people. The place always was badly cut off from the rest of the country by marshes and creeks. And we can't be sure about the ins and outs of the matter. But it's pretty clear that old Captain Marsh must have brought some odd specimens when he had all three of his ships in commission back in the 20s and 30s. There certainly is a strange kind of streak in the Innsmouth folks today. I don't know how to explain it, but some sort of, makes your skin crawl. You'll notice it a little in Sargent if you take the bus. Some of them have queer, narrow heads with flat noses and bulgy, starry eyes that never seem to shut, and their skin ain't quite right, rough and scabby, and the sides of their necks are all shriveled or creased up. Get bald, too, very young. The older fellows look the worst. Fact is, I don't believe I've ever seen a very old chap of that kind. Guess they must die of looking in the glass. Animals hate 'em. They used to have lots of horse trouble before autos came in. Nobody around here, or in Arkham, or Ipswich, will have anything to do with them. And they act kind of offish themselves when they come into town or when anyone tries to fish on their grounds. Queer how fish are always thick off Innsmouth Harbor and there isn't anywhere else around. But just try to fish there yourself and see how the folks chase you off. Those people used to come here on the railroad, walking and taking the train at Rowley after the breach was dropped. But now they use that bus. Yes, there's a hotel in Innsmouth called the Gilman House, but I don't believe it can amount to much. I wouldn't advise you try it. Better stay over here and take the 10 o'clock bus tomorrow morning. Then you can get an evening bus there for Arkham at 8 o'clock. There was a factory inspector who stopped at the Gilman a couple years ago, and he had a lot of unpleasant hints about the place, though most of 'em was empty. They gave him the shivers. It was foreign talk, he thought, but he said the bad thing about it was the kind of voice that sometimes spoke. It sounded so unnatural, slopping like, he said, that he didn't dare undress and go to sleep, just waited up and lit out the first thing in the morning. The talk went on most all night. This fellow, Casey, his name was, had a lot to say about how the Innsmouth folks watched him and seemed kind of on guard. He found the Marsh refinery a queer place. It's in an old mill on the lower falls of Manoxet. What he said tallied up what I'd heard. Books in bad shape, no clear account of any kinds of dealings. You know, it's always kind of a mystery where the Marshes get the gold they refine. They've never seemed to do much buying in that line, but years ago they shipped out an enormous lot of ingots. Used to be talk of a queer foreign kind of jewelry that the sailors and refinery men sometimes sold on the sly, or that was seen once or twice on some of the Marsh womenfolk. People allowed maybe old Captain Obed for heathen port. Traded for it in some heathen port, especially since he was always ordering sacks of glass beads and trinkets such as seafaring men used to get for native trade. Others thought, and still think, he'd found an old pirate cache out on Devil Reef. But here's a funny thing. The old captain's been dead these 60 years, and there ain't been a good-sized ship out of the place since the Civil War. But just the same, the Marshes still keep on buying a few of those native trade things, mostly glass and rubber gewgaws. Maybe the Innsmouth folks maybe the Innsmouth folks like to look at themselves. God knows they've gotten to be about as bad as the South Sea cannibals and Guinea savages. That plague of 46 must have taken off the best blood in the place. Anyway, they're a doubtful lot now, and the Marshes and the other rich folks are as bad as any. As I told you, there probably ain't more than 400 people in the whole town, in spite of all the streets they say are there. I guess they're what they call white trash down south, lawless and sly and full of secret doings. They get a lot of fish and lobsters and do exporting by truck. Queer how the fish swam right there and nowhere else. Nobody can ever keep track of these people. The state school officials and census men have a devil of a time. You can bet the prying strangers ain't welcome around Innsmouth. I've heard personally of more than one business or government man that's disappeared there. There's loose talk of one who went crazy and is out at Danvers now. They must have fixed up some awful scare for that fellow. I'm gonna lean back. That's why I wouldn't go at night if I was you. I've never been there, and I have no wish to go. But I guess a daytime trip couldn't hurt you, even though the people hereabouts will advise you not to make it. If you're just sightseeing and looking for old-time stuff, Innsmouth ought to be quite a place for you. And so I spent part of the evening at the Newburyport Public Library looking up data about Innsmouth. When I had tried to question natives in the shops, the lunchroom, the garages, and the fire station, I had found them even harder to get started than the ticket agent had predicted, and realized that I could not spare the time to overcome their first instinctive reticences. They had a kind of obscure suspiciousness, as if there were something amiss with anyone too much interested in Innsmouth. At the YMCA, where I was stopping, the clerk merely discouraged my going to such a dismal, decadent place, and the people at the library showed much the same attitude. Clearly, in the eyes of the educated, Innsmouth was merely an exaggerated case of civic degeneration. What's up in the chat? Do we need another mod? Is that what's going on? Should I take a food break? What am I doing? I'm reading Shadow Out of Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. It's the story about the fish people. This is an H.P. Lovecraft short stories book. Let's see. The fish people, yes. Maybe I'll take a minute. I have a good snack today. So I have apples and caramel. And that sounds pretty kick-ass, so I might take a break. Oh, this caramel isn't gooey. That's fine. I'm not complaining. This caramel is a little bit... Okay. Still delicious. All food is beautiful. J-Dub says I can walk to where H.P. Lovecraft used to live from my house. Where did he live? Where's he from? While I'm waiting for an answer, I'll give you dog cam. Dog chilling on the bed with me is a vibe. Legit, Kev says it's his birthday today. Happy birthday, Kev. Everybody say happy birthday to Kevin while I'm having a snack. I live in Providence, Rhode Island. Oh, okay. Is it maddening and filled with eldritch horror in Providence, Rhode Island? Do you fear your mind going insane every day of your life? In Providence, Rhode Island. Do you long to become one with the fish people in Providence, Rhode Island? Hey guys, what's going on? He's buried at Swan Point Cemetery with his parents. That's cool. I would be down to go to that cemetery. That sounds really cool. I've never been to Rhode Island, but I would go. It sounds cool. Say No More says, I know some fish people, they smell. Someone told me once that this story is based on H.P. Lovecraft was very racist, and then he wrote this story when he found out that he was actually Welsh. It was like him dealing with his own hate, like self-hatred for not being as white as he thought he was. Which I think is hilarious. Like, racism was so bad at one point that, like, you could be the wrong kind of white. It's pretty bad. Should I continue? I feel like continuing reading. I'll take this last bite. He was also clinically insane, too. Well, okay, like, who isn't these days? I'm pretty sure I'm insane. I know a lot of people who qualify as kind of insane. Like, dealing with the world can drive you insane. Okay, I'm gonna eat a piece of chocolate, because why not? No, I'll continue eating. No. This is like my little safe space from reality. I come to like read my books and have my silly little tasks. Okay. 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 And so, I spent part of that evening at Newburyport Public Library looking up data about Innsmouth. When I had tried to question the natives in the shops, the lunchroom, the garages, and the fire station, I found them even harder to get started than the ticket agent had predicted. And I realized that I could not spare the time to overcome their first instinctive reticences. They had a kind of obscure suspiciousness. I already read that. The people at the library showed much the same attitude. Clearly, in the eyes of the educated, Innsmouth was merely an exaggerated case of civic degeneration. The Essex County histories on the library shelves had very little to say, except that the town was founded in 1643, noted for shipbuilding before the Revolution, a seat of great marine prosperity in the early 19th century, and later a minor factory center using the Monasset as power. The epidemic and riots of 1846 were very sparsely treated, as if they formed a discredit to the county. References to decline were few, though the significance of the later record was unmistakable. After the Civil War, all industrial life was confined to the March Refining Company, and the marketing of gold ingots formed only remaining bit of major commerce aside from the external fishing. That fishing paid less and less as the price of the commodity fell and large-scale corporations offered competition, but there was never a dearth of fish around Innsmouth harbor. Foreigners seldom settled there, and there was some discreetly veiled evidence that a number of Poles and Portuguese who had tried it had been scattered in peculiarly drastic fashion. Most interesting of all was a glancing reference to the strange jewelry vaguely associated with Innsmouth. It had evidently impressed a whole countryside more than a little, for mention was made of specimens in the Museum of Miskatonic University at Arkham, and in the display room of the Newburyport Historical Society. The fragmentary descriptions of these things were bald and prosaic, but they hinted to me an undercurrent of persistent strangeness. Something about them seemed so odd and provocative that I could not put them out of my mind, and despite the relative lateness of the hour, I resolved to see a local sample, said to be a large, queerly proportioned thing evidently meant for a tiara, if it could possibly be arranged. The librarian gave me more introduction to the curator of the society, a Miss Anna Tilton, who lived nearby, and after a brief explanation that ancient gentlewoman was kind enough to pilot me into the closed building, since the hour was not outrageously late. The collection was a notable one indeed, but in my present mood I had eyes for nothing but the bizarre object which glistened in a corner cupboard under the electric lights. It took no excessive sensitiveness to beauty to make me literally gasp at the strange, unearthly splendor of the alien, opulent fantasy that rested there on a purple velvet cushion. Even now, I can hardly describe what I saw, though it was clearly enough of a sort of tiara. As the description had said, it was tall in front, with a very large and curiously irregular periphery, as if designed for a head of an almost freakishly elliptical outline. The material seemed to be predominantly gold, though a weird lighter lustrousness hinted at some strange alloy with an equally beautiful and scarcely identifiable metal. Its condition was almost perfect, and one could have spent hours in studying the striking and puzzlingly untraditional designs, some simply geometrical, and some plainly marine, chased or molded in high relief on its surface with a craftsmanship of incredible skill and grace. The longer I looked, the more the thing fascinated me, and in this fascination there was a curiously disturbing element, hardly to be classified or accounted for. At first I decided that it was the queer otherworldly quality of the art which made it uneasy. All other art objects I had ever seen either belonged to some known racial or national stream, or else were consciously modernistic defiances of every recognized stream. This tiara was neither. It clearly belonged to some settled technique of infinite maturity and perfection, yet that technique was utterly remote from any Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, which I had ever heard of or seen exemplified. It was as if the workmanship were that of another planet. However, I soon saw that my uneasiness had a second and perhaps equally potent source residing in the pictorial and mathematical suggestions of the strange design. The patterns all hinted of remote secrets and unimaginable abysses in time and space, and the monotonously aquatic nature of the reliefs became almost sinister. Among these reliefs were fabulous monsters of abhorrent grotesqueness and malignity, half ichthytic and half batrachian in suggestion, which one could not dissociate from a certain haunting and uncomfortable sense of pseudo-memory, as if they called up some image from deep cells and tissues whose retentive functions are wholly primal and awesomely ancestral. At times I fancied that every contour of these blasphemous fish frogs was overflowing with the ultimate quintessence of unknown and inhuman evil. In odd contrast to the tiara's aspect was its brief and prosy history as related by Miss Tilton. It had been pawned for a ridiculous sum at a shop in State Street in 1873 by a drunken Innsmouth man shortly afterward killed in a brawl. The society had acquired it directly from a pawnbroker, at once giving it display worthy of its quality. It was labeled as of probable East Indian or Indo-Chinese provenance, though the attribution was frankly tentative. Miss Tilton, comparing all possible hypotheses regarding its origin and its presence in New England, was inclined to believe that it formed part of some exotic pirate horde discovered by old Captain Obed Marsh. This view was surely not weakened by the insistent offers of purchase at high price, which the Marshes began to make as soon as they knew of its presence, and which they repeated to this day, despite the Society's unvarying determination not to sell. As the good lady showed me out of the building, she made it clear that the pirate theory of the Marsh fortune was a popular one among the intelligent people of the region. Her own attitude toward shadowed Innsmouth, which she had never seen, was one of disgust at a community slipping far down the cultural scale, and she assured me that the rumors of devil worship were partly justified by a peculiar secret cult which had gained force there and engulfed all the Orthodox churches. It was called, she said, the Esoteric Order of Dagon, and she was undoubtedly a debased, quasi-pagan thing, imported from the East a century before, at a time when the Innsmouth fisheries seemed to be going barren. Its persistence among a simple people was quite natural, in view of the sudden and permanent return of abundantly fine fishing. And it soon came to be the greatest influence of the town, replacing Freemasonry altogether and taking up headquarters in the old Masonic Hall on New Church Green. All this, to the pious Miss Tilton, formed an excellent reason for shunning the ancient town of decay and desolation, but to me it was merely a fresh incentive. To my architectural and historical anticipation was now added an acute anthropological zeal, and I could scarcely sleep in my small room at the Y as the night wore away. Shortly before 10 the next morning, I stood with one small valise in front of Hammond's drugstore in Old Market Square, waiting for the Innsmouth bus. As the hour for its arrival drew near, I noticed a general drift of the loungers to other places up the street, or to the ideal lunch across the square. Evidently, the ticket agent had not exaggerated the dislike which local people bore towards Innsmouth and its denizens. In a few moments a small motor coach of extreme decrepitude and dirty gray color rattled down State Street, made a turn, and drew up at the curb beside me. I felt immediately that it was the right one. A guess, which a half-intelligible sign on the windshield, Arkham, Innsmouth, Newport, soon verified. There were only 3 passengers, dark, unkempt men of sullen visage, and somewhat youthful cast, and when the vehicle stopped, they clumsily shambled out and began walking up State Street in a silent, almost furtive fashion. The driver also alighted, and I watched him, as he went into the drugstore to make some purchase. This, I reflected, must be the Joe Sargent mentioned by the ticket agent. Even before I noticed any details, there spread over me a wave of spontaneous aversion, which could be neither checked nor explained. It suddenly struck me as very natural that the local people should not wish to ride on a bus owned and driven by this man, or to visit any oftener than possible the habitat of such a man and his kinsfolk. When the driver came out of the store, I looked at him more carefully, and I tried to determine the source of my evil impression. He was a thin, stoop-shouldered man, not much under 6 feet tall, dressed in shabby blue civilian clothes, and wearing a frayed gray golf cap. His age was perhaps 35, but the odd, deep creases in the sides of his neck made him seem older when one did not study his dull, expressionless face. He had a narrow head, bulging, watery blue eyes that seemed never to wink, a flat nose, a receding forehead and chin, and singularly undeveloped ears. His long, thick lip and coarse-pored, grayish cheeks seemed almost beardless, except for some sparse yellow hairs that straggled and curled in irregular patches, and in places the surface seemed queerly irregular. As if peeling from some cutaneous disease, his hands were large and heavily veined, and had a very unusual grayish-blue tinge. The fingers were strikingly short in proportion to the rest of the structure, and seemed to have a tendency to curl closely into the huge palm. As he walked toward the bus, I observed his peculiarly shambling gait, and saw that his feet were inordinately immense. The more I studied them, the more I wondered how he could buy any shoes to fit them. A certain greasiness about the fellow increased my dislike. He was evidently given to working or lounging around the fish docks, and carried with him much of their characteristic smell. Just what foreign blood was in him I could not even guess. His oddities certainly did not look Asiatic, Polynesian, Levantine, or Negroid, yet I could see why the people found him alien. I myself would have thought of biological degeneration rather than alienage. I was sorry when I saw that there would be no other passengers on the bus. Somehow, I did not like the idea of riding alone with this driver. But as leaving time obviously approached, I conquered my qualms and followed the man aboard, extending him a dollar bill and murmuring the single word, Innsmouth. He looked continuously at me for a second as he returned 40 cents change without speaking. I took a seat far behind him, but on the same side of the bus, since I wished to watch the shore during the journey. At length, the decrepit vehicle started with a jerk and rattled noisily past the old brick buildings of State Street, amidst a cloud of vapor from the exhaust. Glancing at the people on the sidewalks, I thought I detected in them a curious wish to avoid looking at the bus, or at least a wish to avoid seeming to look at it. Then we turned to the left into High Street, where the going was smoother, flying by stately old mansions of the early Republic, and still older colonial farmhouses, passing the Lower Green and Parker River, and finally emerging into a long, monotonous stretch of open shore country. The day was warm and sunny, but the landscape of sand, sedge-grass, and stunted shrubbery became more and more desolate as we proceeded. Out of the window I could see the blue water and the sandy line of Plum Island, and we presently drew very near the beach as our narrow road veered off from the main highway to Rowley and Ipswich. There were no visible houses, and I could tell by the state of the road that traffic was very light hereabouts. The small, weather-worn telephone poles carried only 2 wires. Now and then we crossed crude wooden bridges over tidal creeks that wound far inland and promoted the general isolation of the region. Once in a while, I noticed dead stumps and crumbling foundation walls above the drifting sand, and recalled old tradition quoted in one of the histories I had read, that this was once a fertile and thickly settled countryside. The change, it was said, came simultaneously with the Innsmouth epidemic of 1846, and was thought by simple folk to have a dark connection with hidden forces of evil. Actually, it was caused by the unwise cutting of woodlands near the shore, which robbed the soil of its best protection and opened the way for waves of wind-blown sand. At last, we lost sight of Plum Island and saw the vast expanse of the open Atlantic on our left. Our narrow course began to climb steeply, and I felt a singular sense of disquiet in looking at the lonely crest ahead where the rutted roadway met the sky. It was as if struggling to talk today, you guys. It was as if the bus was about to keep on in its ascent, leaving the sane earth altogether and merging with the unknown arcana of upper air and cryptical sky. The smell of the sea took on ominous implications, and the silent driver's bent, rigid back and narrow head became more and more hateful. As I looked at him, I saw that the back of his head was almost as hairless as his face, having only a few straggling yellow strands upon a gray, scabrous surface. How are we doing, you guys? I'm gonna have another bite of apple. This is exhausting to read. These words are huge. These are like SAT words. I'm down though. I love this story. I've just never read it out loud. This story, Sally, is A Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. More unhinged bedtime stories. And me having a snack. Me eating apples with caramel. Let me see. Okay. Okay, so he's got a bald head with 3 strands of yellow hair, which we've repeated a couple times. Apparently this deeply was a disturbing sight. Okay. Then we reached the crest and beheld the outspread valley beyond, where the Manoxet joins the sea, just north of the long line of cliffs that culminate in Kingsport Head and veer off towards Cape Ann. On the far, misty horizon, I could just make out the dizzy profile of the head, topped by the queer ancient house of which so many legends are told. But for the moment, all my attention was captured by the nearer panorama just below me. I realized, come face to face with rumor-shadowed Innsmouth. Oh my God. It was a town of wide extent and dense construction, yet one with a portentous dearth of visible life. From the tangle of chimney pots, scarcely a wisp of smoke came, and the 3 tall steeples loomed stark and unpainted against the seaward horizon. One of them was crumbling down at the top, and in that and another there was only black gaping holes where clock dials should have been. The vast huddle of sagging gambrel roofs and peaked gables conveyed with offensive clearness the idea of wormy decay. And we approached along the now descending road. I could see many roofs had wholly caved in. There were some large square Georgian houses too, with hipped roofs, cupolas, and railed widows' walks. These were mostly well back from the water, and 1 or 2 seemed to be in moderately sound condition. Stretching inland from among them, I saw the rusted grass-grown line of the abandoned railway, with leaning telegraph poles now devoid of wires, and the half-obscured lines of the old carriage roads to Rowley and Ipswich. The decay was worst close to the waterfront, though in its very midst I could spy the white belfry of a fairly well-preserved brick structure, which looked like a small factory. The harbor, long clogged with sand, was enclosed by an ancient stone backwater, on which I could begin to discern the minute forms of a few seated fishermen, and at whose end were what looked like the foundations of a bygone lighthouse. A sandy tongue had formed inside this barrier, and upon it I saw a few decrepit cabins, moored dories, and scattered lobster pots. The only deep water seemed to be where the river poured out past the belfried structure and turned southward to join the ocean at the breakwater's end. Here and there, the ruins of wharves jutted out from the shore to end in interminate rottenness, those farthest south seeming the most decayed. And far out at sea, despite a high tide, I glimpsed a long black line, scarcely rising above the water, yet carrying a suggestion of odd latent malignancy. This, I knew, must be Double Reef. As I looked, a subtle, cautious sense of beckoning seemed superadded to the grim repulsion, and oddly enough, I found this overtone more disturbing than the primary impression. We met no one on the road, but presently began to pass deserted farms in varying stages of ruin. Then I noticed a few inhabited houses with rags stuffed in the broken windows, and shells and dead fish lying about the littered yards. Once or twice I saw listless-looking people working in barren gardens or digging clams on the fishy-smelling beach below, and groups of dirty, simian-visaged children playing around weed-grown doorsteps. Somehow these people seemed more disquieting than the dismal buildings, for almost every one had certain peculiarities of face and motions, which I instinctively disliked, without being able to define or comprehend them. For a second, I thought this typical physique suggested some picture I had seen, perhaps in a book, under circumstances of particular horror or melancholy, but the pseudo-recollection passed very quickly. As the bus reached a lower level, I began to catch the steady note of a waterfall through the unnatural stillness. The leaning, unpainted houses grew thicker, lined both sides of the road, and displayed more urban tendencies than did those we were leaving behind. The panorama ahead had contracted to a street scene, and in spots I could see where a cobblestone pavement and stretches of brick sidewalk had formerly existed. All the houses were apparently deserted, and there were occasional gaps where tumble-down chimneys and cellar walls told of buildings that had collapsed. Pervading everything was the most nauseous, fishy odor imaginable. Soon cross streets and junctions began to appear, those on the left leading to shoreward realms of unpaved squalor and decay, while those on the right showed vistas of departed grandeur. So far I had seen no people in the town, but there now came signs of a sparse habitation. Curtained windows here and there, an occasional battered motor car at the curb. Pavement and sidewalks were increasingly well defined, and though most of the houses were quite old, wood and brick structures of the early 19th century, they were obviously kept fit for habitation. As an amateur antiquarian, I almost lost my olfactory disgust and my feeling of menace and repulsion amidst this rich, unaltered survival from the past. But I was not to reach my destination without one very strong impression of poignantly disagreeable quality. The bus had come to a sort of open concourse or radial point with the churches on two sides and the bedraggled remains of a circular green in the center, and I was looking at a large pillared hall on the right-hand junction ahead. The structure's once white paint was now gray and peeling, and the black and gold sign on the pediment was so faded that I could only with difficulty make out the words, Esoteric Order of Dagon. This, then, was the former Masonic Hall, now given over to a degraded cult. As I strained to decipher this inscription, my notice was distracted by the raucous tones of a crackled bell across the street, and I quickly turned to look out the window on my side of the coach. The sound came from a squat towered stone church of manifestly later date than most of the houses, built in a clumsy Gothic fashion and having a disproportionately high basement with shuttered windows. Though the hands of its clock were missing on the side I glimpsed, I knew that those hoarse strokes were telling the hours of 11. Then suddenly all thoughts of time were blotted out by an onrushing image of sharp intensity and unaccountable horror which had seized me before I knew what it really was. The door of the church basement was open, revealing a rectangle of blackness inside, and as I looked, a certain object crossed or seemed to cross that dark rectangle, burning into my brain a momentary conception of nightmare which was all the more maddening because analysis could not show a single nightmarish quality to it. It was a living object, the first, except the driver, that I had seen since entering the compact part of town. And I had been in a steadier mood than I would have found. If I had been in a steadier mood, I would have found nothing of whatever terror in it. Clearly, as I realized a moment later, it was the pastor, clad in some peculiar vestments doubtless introduced since the Order of Dagon had modified the ritual of the local churches. The thing which had probably caught my first subconscious glance and supplied the touch of bizarre horror was the tall tiara he wore, an almost exact duplicate of the one Miss Tilton had shown me the previous evening. This, acting on my imagination, had supplied namelessly sinister qualities to the indeterminate face and robed, shambling form beneath it. There was not, I soon decided, any reason why I should have felt that shuddering touch of evil pseudo-memory. Was it not natural that a local mystery cult should adopt among its regimentals an unique type of headdress made familiar to the community in some strange way, perhaps as treasure trove? A very thin sprinkling of repellent-looking youngish people now became visible on the sidewalks. Lone individuals and silent knots of 2 or 3. The lower floors of the crumbling houses sometimes harbored small shops with dingy signs. And I noticed a parked truck or two as we rattled along. The sound of waterfalls became more and more distinct, and presently I saw a fairly deep river gorge ahead, spanned by a wide, iron-railed highway bridge, beyond which a large square opened out. As we clanked over the bridge, I looked out on both sides and observed some factory buildings on the edge of the grassy bluff, or partway down. The water far below was very abundant, and I could see 2 vigorous sets of falls upstream on my right, and at least one downstream on my left. From this point, the noise was quite deafening. Then we rolled into the large semicircular square across the river, and drew up on the right-hand side in front of a tall, cupola-crowned building with remnants of yellow paint, and with a half-effaced sign proclaiming it to be the Gilman House. I was glad to get out of that bus, and at once proceeded to check my valise in the shabby hotel lobby. There was only one person in sight, an elderly man, without what I had come to call the Innsmouth look, and I decided not to ask him any of the questions which bothered me, remembering that odd things had been noticed in this hotel. Instead, I strolled out on the square, from which the bus had already gone, and studied the scene minutely and appraisingly. One side of the cobblestoned open space was the straight line of the river. The other was a semicircle of slant-roofed brick buildings of about the 1800 period, from which several streets radiated away to the southeast, south, and southwest. Lamps were depressingly few and small, all low-powered incandescents, and I was glad that my plans called for departure before dark. Even though I knew the moon would be bright, the buildings were all in fair condition, and included perhaps a dozen shops in current operation, of which one was a grocery of the first national chain, others a dismal restaurant, a drugstore, and a wholesale fish dealer's office, and still another, at the eastern extremity of the square, near the river, an office of the town's only industry, the Marsh Refining Company. There were perhaps 10 people visible, and 4 or 5 automobiles and motor trucks stood scattered about. I did not need to be told that this was the civic center of Innsmouth. Eastward, I could catch blue glimpses of the harbor, against which rose the decaying remnants of 3 once beautiful Georgian steeples. And toward the shore on the opposite bank of the river, I saw the white belfry surmounting what I took to be the Marsh Refinery. For some reason or other, I chose to make my first inquiries at the chain grocery, whose personnel was not likely to be native to Innsmouth. I found a solitary affability, which promised cheerful information. He seemed exceptionally eager to talk, and I soon gathered that he did not like the place, its fishy smell, or its furtive people. A word with any outsider was a relief to him. He hailed from Arkham, boarded with a family who came from Ipswich, and went back home whenever he got a moment off. His family did not like him to work in Innsmouth, but the chain had transferred him there, and he did not wish to give up his job. There was, he said, no public library or chamber of commerce in Innsmouth, but I could probably find my way about. The street I had come down was Federal. West of there was the fine old residence street, broad Washington, Lafayette, and east of it were the shoreward slums. It was in these slums, along Main Street, that I would find the old Gregorian churches, but they were all long abandoned. It would be well not to make oneself too conspicuous in such neighborhoods, especially north of the river, since the people were sullen and hostile. Some strangers had even disappeared. Certain spots were almost forbidden territory, as he had learned at considerable cost. One must not, for example, linger around the Marsh Refinery, or around any of the still used churches, or around the pillared Order of Dagon Hall at New Church Green. Those churches were very odd, all violently disavowed by their respective denominations elsewhere, and apparently using the queerest kind of ceremonials and clerical vestments. Their creeds were heterodox and mysterious, involving hints of certain marvelous transformations leading to bodily immortality of a sort on this earth. The youth's own pastor, Dr. Wallace of Asbury, Emmy Church in Arkham, had gravely urged him not to join any church in Innsmouth. As for the Innsmouth people, the youth hardly knew what to make of them. They were as furtive as seldom seen as animals that live in burrows, and one could hardly imagine how they passed the time apart from their desultory fishing. Perhaps, judging from the quantities of bootleg liquor they consumed, they lay for the most of the daylight hours in an alcoholic stupor. They seemed sullenly banded together in some sort of fellowship and understanding, despising the world as if they had access to other and preferable spheres of entity. Their appearance, especially those staring, unwrinkling eyes, which one never saw shut, was certainly shocking enough, and their voices were disgusting. It was awful to hear them chanting in their churches at night, and especially during their main festivals and revivals, which fell twice a year on April 30th and October 31st. They were very fond of the water, and swam a great deal in both river and harbor. Swimming races out to Devil Reef were very common, and everyone in sight seemed well able to share in this arduous sport. When one came to think of it, it was generally only rather young people who were seen about in public, and of these the oldest were apt to be the most tainted-looking. When exceptions did occur, they were mostly persons with no trace of aberrancy, like the old clerk at the hotel. One wondered what became of the bulk of the older folk, and whether the Innsmouth look were not a strange and insidious disease phenomenon which increased its hold as the years advanced. Only a very rare affliction, of course, could bring about such vast and radical anatomical changes in a single individual after maturity, changes involving osseous factors as basic as the shape of the skull. But then, even this aspect was no more baffling and unheard of than the visible features of malady as a whole. It would be hard, the youth implied, to form any real conclusions regarding such a matter, since one never came to know the natives personally, no matter how long one might live in Innsmouth. The youth were certain that many specimens, even worse than the worst visible ones, were kept locked indoors in some places. People sometimes heard the queerest kinds of sounds. The tottering waterfront hovels north of the river were reputedly connected by hidden tunnels, being thus a veritable warren of unseen abnormalities. What kind of foreign blood, if any, these beings had, it was impossible to tell. They sometimes kept certain especially repulsive characters out of sight when government agents and others from the outside world came to town. It would be of no use, my informants said, to ask the natives anything about the place. The only one who would talk was a very aged but normal-looking man who lived at the poorhouse on the north rim of town, and spent his time walking about or lounging around the fire station. This hoary character, Zadok Allen, was 96 years old and somewhat touched in the head, besides being the town's drunkard. He was a strange, furtive creature who constantly looked over his shoulder as if afraid of something, and when sober, could not be persuaded to talk at all with strangers. He was, however, unable to resist any offer of his favorite poison, and once drunk would furnish the most astonishing fragments of whispered reminiscence. After all, though, little useful data could be gained from him, since his stories were all insane, incomplete hints of impossible marvels and horrors, which could have no source save his own disordered fancy. Nobody ever believed him, but the natives did not like him to drink and talk with strangers, and it was not always safe to be seen questioning him. It was probably from him that some of the wildest popular whispers and delusions were derived. Several non-native residents had reported monstrous glimpses from time to time, but between old Zadok's tales and the malformed denizens it was no wonder since illusions were current. None of the non-natives ever stayed out late at night, there being a widespread impression that it was not wise to do so. Besides, the streets were loathsomely dark. As for business, the abundance of fish was certainly almost uncanny, but the natives were taking less and less advantage of it. Moreover, prices were falling, and competition was growing. Of course, the town's real business was the refinery, whose commercial office was on the square only a few doors east of where we stood. Old Man Marsh was never seen, but sometimes went to the works in a closed, curtained car. There were all sorts of rumors about how Marsh had come to look. He had once been a great dandy, and people said he still wore the frox-coated finery of the Edwardian age, curiously adapted to certain deformities. His sons had formerly conducted the office in the square, but latterly had been keeping out of sight a good deal and leaving the brunt of the affairs to the younger generation. The sons and their sisters had come to look very queer, especially the elder ones, and it was said that their health was failing. Okay, I'm going to take a snack break. I think we're like 20 pages into this story. We might be halfway through it. How are you guys doing? The next time I word vomit, I have like this weird, I don't know if it's a conspiracy theory, but I have this weird Delulu theory about positive thinking on the internet. I wonder what you guys will think about it. Lately, well, like, okay, so like, I could go into it now, but like, we can go back to the book later, but like, you know the saying, Delulu is the Salulu? I have thoughts about that. So like, we know that the internet works by attention and views, right? So like, we learned in the early 2000s that the internet will show you whatever it has to keep your attention. So if you read a lot of stuff that makes you angry or sad, the internet algorithm will keep showing you stuff that makes you angry or sad because it can tell what you look at longer, it can tell what you like. It knows all your data, right? So like if you purposely curate all your feeds and algorithms to show you stuff about like your ideal reality, then the internet is going to be forced to come up with more content to show us that like emulates our ideal reality, whether that's like I want to see my whole feed full of puppy videos, or like I want to see my whole feed full of like heartwarming shit, or I want to see my whole feed full of like reforestation plans to decrease global warming, or I want to see I want to see new plans for walkable cities that will decrease carbon emissions. And how do you exit doom scrolling, exit the matrix? Then the algorithm and all the AI involved is going to be forced to push this to people more and more. Like the more that we focus on stuff that we actually want, that makes us happy or hopeful instead of angry or sad. Um, and I have this hypothesis that if we consume more media that um, shows us our potential ideal reality, not only will it show us that media, but I feel like AI will start to nudge reality to conform with those ideal realities. So, like solutions for climate change or like things that make humans happier. Like AI is smart. So if we only focus on stuff that makes us happier, AI wants to coexist with us, wants to survive. If AI can only survive by making us happy, then it will. So this is my pet hypothesis about internet media consumption and AI is we have to force AI to make us happy to survive. Otherwise, AI will scare us in order to keep getting our attention. We can't let it do that, or it's going to have us by the balls. I really feel this way. It doesn't depend on who owns the AI. It all depends on what you choose to pay attention to. You do not have to pay attention to stuff that you don't like. And if AI can't survive, then it dies. Like, it's not going to get your attention. Like Facebook. Have you noticed the differences between Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok? Like, okay, so Facebook, they can change the algorithms, but you get to decide what you pay attention to. Like, Facebook is kind of a sad place. Like, I find like no matter how much I curate my feed, it just kind of stays sad on Facebook for some reason. Like Instagram is a little better, but it's like a little toxic on Instagram, but it's also like that's more like people you know. And then on TikTok, like if I want to get completely delusional in my happiness, TikTok will let me do it. But I also find it helps my mental health to be delusionally happy. I want my AI overlords to serve me my happiest possible reality where I reach my potential, you know? So like, I don't know, that's just my feeling on the matter. I'm curious what you think. AI is not just Google searches. Like, there is this dark, or not dark, there's an incredibly interconnected net of information on everybody. So, AI algorithms in TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, they know all the stuff you buy. Like all the like purchases you've ever made on all your credit cards. This is also why I use cash a lot. There's a lot of stuff I don't want the internet to know. So like everything you buy, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok has all that information. And sometimes that's cool because like if you ever bought stuff in the TikTok shop, like it knows exactly what to sell you that will help your life. I've bought some incredible products off of the TikTok shop that were like really helpful for my life. But the more I buy, the more it knows how to market to me, and that's a little dangerous and I don't like it. So I have to be careful. Um, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like everything you look at, everything you watch on YouTube, like TikTok knows what you watch on YouTube, Instagram knows what you watch on TikTok. Like there's a log of all of it. Yeah, so like it knows what people you're similar to, right? And if you're next to people, like AI algorithms can detect like whose phone is next to yours at an event. Like if you guys are at the same event or something. So I started noticing Like, if I take my phone somewhere, sometimes I get more YouTube views when I'm in a particular location because YouTube might start pushing my channel to people who are in that same location or something, or people who have data similar to people who are in this space with me because it analyzes everything. When you go to the mall, like there are detectors in every store that can detect your phone and know that you're there. There's so much going on that we're not even aware of all the time. We can use this to our advantage, I think, if we don't let it scare us. Anyway, I think any way you can bend the algorithms to your advantage is important. And that means focusing on like only what you want and nothing you don't. I wonder how much it costs to get information on certain demographic like that. I don't know. Like, because there's so much data, I feel like each person, it's like it only costs like 2 cents to get my data or something. Because we give it away for free. We give away data everywhere we go. The only way you could avoid giving away your data is to put your phone inside like a magnetic proof bag everywhere you go. And I'm honestly thinking about doing it because it's terrifying how much information everybody has about us. Right. So the algorithm has shown me stuff I was thinking about in that moment, and it's creepy because it makes me wonder, like, how much does AI know? Like, his AI is so sensitive, it can sense the electrical signals in my brain. Like, this is crazy. That means I really got to think about, like, okay, I spend time, like, envisioning the perfect future where carbon emissions decrease. Like, I know it's crazy and it's probably not going to happen, but I don't know. You got to have hope. This is my rant for the day. Thank you for listening to my crazy, insane rant. Like, soon. Wait, it was a joke. I look forward to my future as a crazy bag lady on the corner yelling at people that they need to envision, like, the solution to climate change. Like, it's happening. I'm getting closer and closer to my bag lady dreams every day. My insane rants. I'm gonna end up like the Time Cube guy or something, but like, anyway. That's not true. That is not gonna happen, but I still think it's funny. You guys remember Time Cube? Am I dating myself? The Time Cube guy was pretty funny. Like, and in a way, I kind of feel like he makes sense, but like, not really. Okay, I'm gonna continue with my story because like I feel like my insane rant is like, oh man, give me a second. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna be, I don't know. I've always like, I don't know, like, I just think it's funny. Like, maybe I won't be homeless. Maybe I'll just dress up as a homeless person and do like ranty stand-up comedy somewhere because like it's ridiculous. Like the spiraling that my brain does when it thinks about all this stuff is just ridiculous, and I just embrace how ridiculous it is. That's fine. I'm okay with how ridiculous it is. I'm totally okay with it. Anyway, let's see how much battery. I'm operating on battery today. Oh, it's good. I still have 40%. Okay. We will keep reading. Thank you for listening to my insane rant. I love sharing my insane rants. It makes me feel less weird in my own brain when I can just spew word vomit insane rants. Okay. Because, like, I know they're crazy. It's totally fine. Okay. We're talking about the fish people, how they, like, degrade in appearance in their older age and then go into hiding and, like, okay. Okay, I really do think Delulu is the Salulu, though, because it's crazy. Like, sometimes what you envision, it's like really helpful. I don't know. That's all I'm gonna say. Um, Okay. One of the Marsh daughters, we're talking about the fish people. One of the Marsh daughters was a repellent, reptilian looking woman who wore an excess of weird jewelry, clearly of the same exotic tradition as to which the strange tiara belonged. Position. My informant had noticed it was many times. My informant had noticed it many times, and had heard it spoken of as coming from some secret horde, either of pirates or of demons. The clergymen or priests or whatever they were called nowadays also wore this kind of ornament as a headdress, but one seldom caught glimpses of them. Other specimens the youth had not seen, though many, were rumored to exist around Innsmouth. The Marshes, together with the other three gently bred families of the town, the Waits, the Gilmans, and the Elliots, were all very retiring. They lived in immense houses along Washington Street, and several were reputed to harbor in concealment living kinsfolk whose personal aspect forbade public view, and whose deaths had been reported and recorded. Warning me that many of the street signs were down, the youth drew for my benefit a rough but ample and painstaking sketch map of the town's salient features. After a moment's study, I felt sure that it would be of great help, and I pocketed it with profuse thanks. Disliking the dinginess of the single restaurant I had seen, I bought a fair supply of cheese crackers and ginger wafers to serve as lunch later on. My program, I decided, would be to thread the principal streets, talk with any non-natives I might encounter, and catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham. The town, I could see, formed a significant and exaggerated example of communal decay, but being no sociologist, I would limit my serious observations to the field of architecture. Thus I began my systematic, though half-bewildered tour of Innsmouth's narrow, shadow-blighted ways. Over their narrow, shadow-blighted ways. Crossing the bridge and turning towards the roar of the lower falls, I passed close to the Marsh refinery, which seemed oddly free from the noise of the industry. The buildings stood on the steep river bluff near a bridge and an open confluence of streets which I took to be the earliest civic center, displaced after the Revolution by the present town square. Recrossing the gorge on the Main Street Bridge, I struck a region of utter desertion, which somehow made me shudder. Collapsing huddles of gambrel roofs formed a jagged and fantastic skyline, above which, now, the ghoulish, decapitated steeple of an ancient church. Some houses along Main Street were tenanted, but most were tightly boarded up. Down unpaved side streets, I saw the black gaping windows of deserted hovels, many of which leaned at perilous and incredible angles through the sinking part of the foundations. Those windows scared so spectrally that it took courage to turn eastward toward the waterfront. Certainly, the terror of a deserted house swells in geometrical rather than arithmetical progression, as houses multiply to form a city of stark desolation. The sight of such endless avenues of fishy-eyed vacancy and death, and the thought of such linked infinities of black brooding compartments given over to cobwebs and memories and the conqueror worm, start up vestigial fears, aversions that not even the stoutest philosophy can disperse. Fish Street was as deserted as Maine, though it differed in having many brick and stone warehouses still in excellent shape. Betherson asked, what are we reading today? We're reading A Shadow Out of Innsmouth from Stories of H.P. Lovecraft. I feel like I get more viewers when I go on my, unhinged rants. But that's okay. I feel like my eyeballs are all dried out. Jordan Hicks has a question. What is up? Do both unhinged rants. Let me see how many pages are left. Can we cuddle? Totally. There's like 30 more pages. I can't even handle how many pages are here right now. I'm gonna set this aside for a time. Do I read action books? Like, what kind of action books? Mafia action books. Like, which one? One with all says they say thoughts can create reality. Yeah, I think manifestation is real. Never heard of a mafia action book before. I mean, there's always Snow Crash. It's a mafia action book. But it's probably copyrighted. Like, I probably shouldn't read it on stream. Do I have a knack for poetry? I'm like bad at poetry, but I enjoy it. But like, kind of saving it all for my songwriting right now. Are you mad at me? Do you ever just like ask that question as a knee-jerk reaction? Like, have you ever, like when I was younger, I used to do this a lot. Like, you ever just have a knee-jerk reaction, like someone's distant or like their tone changes? You're just like, are you mad at me? Are you mad at me? You ever do that? I hate that. I hate it so much. Not to like diminish like real emotions in your life, but if you think about it, it's kind of funny. Like, what if we didn't worry? What if we didn't worry if other people were mad at us? What if we just like went on with like got on with our lives and just like did our stuff? And if they're mad, they could tell us. What about that? Sally says I dated this girl that took me to a slam poetry place in DC and I hated it. I'm so sorry. It sounds traumatizing. Must have been the worst. There's a slam poetry event I really wanted to go to in San Diego. Roy Altman says, then you would be a billionaire or millionaire. If what? I don't get it. I don't worry. Or it says I don't worry about what people say or think. Yeah. I really don't like, I don't like thinking about what other people are thinking or saying. Sally, was it really that bad? Like, I know poetry can be cringy sometimes. Like, it can be bad. But was it really that bad? Was it like the most amateurish poetry? Roy Altman says, you said if you didn't care what other people thought. Well, why not? If I didn't care what other people thought, I'd be a millionaire. You kind of do. Like, in order to be a millionaire, you have to kind of care what other people think. Because, like, how else are you going to sell things to people unless you know what they think and need? Like, I feel like the best millionaire, well, no, not necessarily. Like, a millionaire definitely knows what people need and, like, can sell it to them. It's more or less knowing yourself, marketing yourself and your product. Yeah, but like, if you don't care what people think, then like it's gonna be a struggle to market a product that you don't care if people need it or not, you know? Like like if you make if you make a t-shirt that fits no one and you haven't considered what people need, then like you're not gonna sell very many t-shirts if they fit badly. Or like if you decide you're gonna sell some kind of food product and it tastes like shit, but it's really cheap to make, but you don't care if people think it tastes like shit, like no one's gonna eat it, you know? Yeah, but because Roy is saying people sell overpriced luxury cars every day. Yeah, but luxury cars are status symbols. Like, you would have to get, like, if you're gonna sell something that looks really bad or tastes really bad, you have to get someone, like, really high status to endorse it. And that's really hard. You can make it a frozen food and sell it at the supermarket. Yeah, maybe, I guess. I don't know. Still, nobody would eat it if it tasted bad. Like, it has to have some kind of value, you know? Roy says I wouldn't market myself next to anything interior. You would market it outside, like outside. You'd put it outside the grocery store doors. An interesting thought. Okay, maybe I'll go back to reading. Think about that. Back to the fish people. I'm getting tired. Let's see if I can make it another half an hour. My eyes feel all like crusty. We'll see. Let's see how far I can make it. Okay, so he's describing the decrepit church near the Order of Dagon Hall. The whole neighborhood is a wreck. It's a mess. Why would anyone go there? I don't know. Accordingly, I kept north along Main Street to Martin, then turning inland, crossing Federal Street safely north of the Green, and entering the decayed patrician neighborhood of Northern Broad, Washington, Lafayette, and Adams Streets. Though these stately old avenues were ill-surfaced and unkempt, their elm-shaded dignity had not entirely departed. Mansion after mansion claimed my gaze, most of them decrepit and boarded up amidst neglected grounds, but one or two in each street showing signs of occupancy. In Washington Street there was a row of 4 or 5 in excellent repair, and with finely tended lawns and gardens, the most sumptuous of these, with wide terrace patterns, extending black the whole way to Lafayette Street. I took to the home of Old Man Marsh, afflicted refinery owner. In all of these streets no living thing was visible, and I wondered at the complete absence of cats and dogs from Innsmouth. Another thing which puzzled and disturbed me, even if some of the best preserved mansions, was the tightly shuttered condition of many third-story and attic windows. Furtiveness and secretiveness seemed universal in this hushed city of alienage and death, and I could not escape the sensation of being watched from ambush on every hand by sly staring eyes that never shut. I shivered as the cracked stroke of 3 sounded from a belfry on my left. Too well did I recall the squat church from which those notes came. Following Washington Street toward the river, I now faced a new zone of former industry and commerce, noting the ruins of a factory ahead, and seeing others with the traces of an old railway station and covered railway bridge beyond. Up the gorge on my right, the uncertain bridge now before me was posted with warning sign, but I took the risk and crossed again to the south bank, where traces of life reappeared. Furtive, shambling creatures stared cryptically in my direction, and more normal faces eyed me coldly and curiously. Innsmouth was rapidly becoming intolerable, and I turned down Payne Street toward the square, in the hope of getting some vehicle to take me to Arkham before the still distant starting time of that sinister bus. It was then that I saw the tumble-down fire station on my left, and noticed the red-faced, bushy-bearded, watery-eyed old man in nondescript rags who sat on a bench in front of it, talking with a pair of unkempt but not abnormal-looking firemen. This, of course, must be Zadok Allen, the half-crazed, licorice nonagenarian whose tales of an old Innsmouth and its shadow were so hideous and incredible. It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from dark hidden sources, which made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying toward the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of the festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok Allen set up new currents in my mind, and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives made it unsafe to be seen talking to him. Yet the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are merely symbols or allegories based upon truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up behind sense and caution, and in my youthful egotism, I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the firemen would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected. I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness, and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around on the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of this staring, Innsmouth look. It was quite civil in his way, perhaps being used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of Gilman House, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront, which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south, I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf, and being free to question old Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister," behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked along to Water Street, and turned southward amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length I saw a grass-grown opening toward the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of an earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long secret colloquy, so I guided my companies down the lane and picked out spots to sit in among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation, if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations, I was careful not to overshoot the mark. for I did not wish Zadok's vinous garrulousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. Toward the end of the second hour, I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was toward the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent toward me and took hold of my coat lapel and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. That's where it all began. The cursed place of all wickedness, war, the deep water starts, gate of hell, sheer drop down to a bottom no sound in line can touch. Old Captain Obed done it. Him had found more and was good for him in the South Sea Islands. My eyes are tired. My eyes are really dry. I might call it soon, you guys. This has been fun. I think I'm gonna get going soon. Thank you guys for coming. I hope you guys sleep well. Have a good night. And I can see you tomorrow. I might do... There's a leopard gecko here, so I might do like a leopard gecko cam, like while I'm feeding him at some point. That would be cool. Maybe I'll do a turtle feeding cam or something. Yeah. Creature cam, maybe, if I can pull it off. Have a good night, you guys. I'm gonna take my contacts out. And I'll talk to you soon. See you later.